Allow me please to welcome everyone to this lecture and discussion with Mary Bilder. I'm not going to give extensive introductions because I'm so interested to hear what all the speakers are going to say. I'm just going to say that our guest, Professor Bilder, has long been one of my go-to founding era legal historians, beginning with her book on the transatlantic constitution, which completely changed my understanding of federalism and where it all came from. And now she has more recently written this book, Madison's Hand, which is just a monumental work of science and history, I think it's fair to say, since she has used scientific techniques to study the papers and the actual documentary record that James Madison gave us of the Constitutional Convention, and it is filled with surprises on every page. And so after she has spoken briefly to 15, 20 minutes or however she wants, I'll sit here for hours if she wants to. After she's finished, then we're going to hear comments on her work from three of Stanford's own legal historians, beginning with Jack Rakoff on the far left there from the history department, and Bernie Mylar from the law school, and Jonathan Guinap also from the history department here. They'll each give quite brief reactions. We'll have a little bit of interplay, and then I hope we'll have a good time for questions from the audience. So, Mary, welcome to Stanford. Thank you for coming. You have the floor.
Let's see. So this just puts me up like this, I guess. Let me thank Michael McConnell for inviting me, and I gave a part of this at a conference he invited me to a couple of years ago, so it's nice to be back. And to Jack and Jonathan and Bernie for being here and being willing to comment. To Mark Storsley, who not only has managed my whole visit, but also got me access to, Stanford has databases that BC can't afford, and so I was madly before this searching databases that I don't have personal access to, and he made that possible, and I'm very grateful to that. And for all of you for coming out in what I think is the first week of your school, which is very nice of you. I wouldn't be back here if it were
not to mention the first rainstorm in 10 years.
So the book has been out for, I guess, a little over a year, and Harvard's finally agreed to do a paperback next fall. They were determined to milk all the money they could out of the book. It's been a relative bestseller by academic standards, which means if you sell more than like 300 copies, you're top of the list. And there's been a number of reviews written by people, and that has been fun, and I've spoken quite a bit about it. And I think that once one speaks about the book, the book, you write a book, and then it sort of becomes its own thing. My first book never did, because not that many people read it, although Michael was nice to say that. And so this has been quite a different experience for me. And I'm not sure I actually have a lot of perspective that I didn't have, but I think a little bit like Madison, I have now revised my thoughts, and I'm persuaded that I said in the book things that I may or may not have said in the book. So I'm going to say things, and then these people can tell me, like, actually, you never said that anywhere in your book, and it's exactly like what you wrote about. What I'm going to talk from is a little bit of a text that I wrote for a conference I went to at Wisconsin, which was called Some Thoughts on How Madison's Hand is of Possible Interest to Con Law Folks, a very rough draft with no immediate plans of publication. I briefly considered writing something that like a law review would publish, and then I was like, oh, whatever. But so it's a little bit more law-y than I would. And I just have to say that after Justice Scalia died, I thought that was sad for a lot of reasons. It was also sad because I thought, well, no one's going to care about my book any longer because, there's nothing about originalism explicitly in the book. But with Scalia's death, I thought that would change. But he's not the only person on the court who's interested in this topic, and Justice Roberts wrote in a dissent in a case called Wellness International in 2015. He wrote, Madison was the principal drafter of the Constitution, and he knew what he was talking about. And I guess if there's one takeaway from my book, it's that my book pretty much disagrees with that completely, that he was either the principal drafter or that he knew what he was talking about. He knew what he was talking about, but he changed his mind about what he thought he knew what he was talking about. So the book argues, takes Madison's notes, which are the most prominent source for our knowledge of the Constitutional Convention and remain the standard authority, and they talk about the distance between the notes and the actual convention. The book's a biography of the notes, which is a comment that Jack Rakoff made when he read a very early draft of the book, and I think really one of the most astute things anybody said about the book itself. And it explores the manuscript both as a text and also as an artifact, and it argues that the notes were not written in the summer of 1787 in their entirety, that they were not taken for us, but that they were written as a legislative diary for Madison and also for Thomas Jefferson, who was in Paris, and that they were revised by Madison as he changed his understanding about the convention, the Constitution, and his own role. And they tell a story about Madison transforming something that started as an incomplete political diary into eventually a seemingly impartial and objective account of the writing of the Constitution. Now, this is not the book I set out to write. When I started writing, I had little kids, and I was looking for a project that I would never have to leave home and go on no research trips, and I could write from my office. That was the plan. And I had realized, I was an English major as an undergraduate, and I realized that no one had written an account of the notes of the convention, sort of a la like if you treated it like Daniel Defoe, Robinson Crusoe. So I was going to do like the English major thing on the notes of the convention, never leave my office, and that was the plan. And I started, because of that, looking for a text that I could use as the basis for my English major deconstruction of Madison's notes. And I couldn't find one. Like every version I looked at took me back to an earlier version. And the book really became very much an effort to first just reconstruct what he had actually written that summer. And then basically, once I'd done that, to retell the story of what it looked like, what the convention looked like from that perspective. I spent a lot of time at the Library of Congress. The Library of Congress considered me a complete nut at the beginning. I think they kind of considered me a nut at the end also, but I got to see the notes a couple times. They gave me enormous access. I'm incredibly grateful to them. I'm happy to talk a little bit about various funny experiences I had, trying not to sneeze on the notes or bleed on the notes or other things that happened in the course of doing that. I have to say that one of the things I have reflected on a lot in the last year has been how much the story of political events in the last year resonate with the story I tell in the book. Because part of what the story in the book is how quickly certain political events can change our ability to understand what happened at the time. And I notice this because, this happened with Brexit, then with the nomination of Donald Trump, and then the election of Donald Trump. And I noticed my faculty, I sit at lunch with some friends, and on each one of these, ahead of time, people were like, oh, this is going to happen, blah, 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 Donald Trump never get the nomination, whatever. And then about 3 weeks later, everybody would be like, well, as I said when I was saying that Donald Trump was going to get the nomination, and now, like, my entire faculty is convinced that they all thoroughly believe that Donald Trump was going to be elected, they understood it, they predicted it, and it's not a false thing, it's just that events alter our ability to remember the past. And so in some ways the book really talks about that, although I wrote the book before any of that happened. So let me just talk about a couple overarching ideas. One, the book talks about the notes as text and artifact, and for I think con law folks, the takeaway, if you want the short takeaway, is that the notes that people cite, the records of the Federal Convention, are far more unreliable than we have understood. I argue that the material before August 21st, 1787, most of that was written that summer, but it was revised in all sorts of ways that make it appear different than we might expect. In particular, most of the explicit textual references were added later. And so the notes for the beginning, in the way that they were originally written, have much less interest in the precise wording of the convention. And then in that section also, I argue that a number of Madison's speeches, many of his most important speeches, were actually also revised, that he swapped them out later on, and there's a complicated argument about this that I'm sure people will have comments on. But part of it is I try and tell a story in which, in that summer, some of Madison's most famous ideas came out of conversations he had at the convention, as opposed to him coming to the convention with the great American Republic worked out. And conversely, things that he said that summer became political third rails after the convention. Ways that he had aligned himself with certain people became incredibly problematic, and he eventually removed those lines, I argue, to make himself acceptable to a new political world, largely a political world in which Thomas Jefferson and republicanism matters. And then I argue that the last third of the manuscript, the part after August 22nd, was written 2 years later. This for people who aren't inside con law people, this may seem irrelevant, but almost everything we care about what happened in that summer happens after August 22nd, and that section, I argue, was all written 2 years later, after the convention, after the Constitution's ratified, after they know that the Constitution is going to be ratified by adding things to the end as opposed to interweaving them, after they've begun to try and interpret the Constitution. After all of that, then Madison goes back and makes those changes. And what does that mean, sort of as a large takeaway? It again means that to the degree that Madison's notes suggest that people were super interested in the text of the Constitution, in the specific words, as opposed to the ideas, a lot of that is the product of him rewriting it 2 years later. And so that sort of focus on the text maybe is a later creation. A second thing that the book really focuses on is the distance between the notes that Madison took and the convention. And here, let me just make a couple comments. I argue the notes belong to a genre of legislative diaries. This is something very familiar to people who work in British parliamentary studies, but Americans have always treated the notes, even though they call them the notes, as if they're sort of objective, like the congressional record. And the book really tries to argue they're not. They're a political diary kept for his own purposes, and that we really need to read these much more in light of purposes. This is also true, would also be applicable to the Maclay diary, which is the only diary we have of how the Bill of Rights is written, which again gets read a little bit like this. And then I argue that the notes themselves were what historians would call a fair copy of Rough Notes, that is, they aren't his contemporaneous Rough Notes, that he wrote them up probably twice a week during that summer, so he was always revising them anyway as he wrote, and that in the process of creating this fair copy, what we have as the notes, he translated speakers into his own vocabulary. So everybody sounds like they're talking about the same thing because it went through Madison's own mind, and that this process also began the process of creating Madison in the way that we come to know Madison. His versions of his speeches, I argue, are more moderate and more logical, more organized than other people heard them. You can't take notes when you're speaking, and I argue he wrote himself up the way we might all want to write ourselves up, in a more organized, more logical sense, and that he eventually went back and actually revised a lot of his emotion and comments out, and so he becomes a much more moderate person over time, and that the notes also reflect the rhythm of the convention. That is, we ought to read the notes more with a sense of the rhythm, and that the notes collapse in August, partly because he becomes sick, but partly because the convention moves to committees, and so it becomes almost impossible for people to figure out what's happening or how things are being decided. And then third, I think the piece that, and I know Jonathan and Jack both have opinions about this. I argue that in all sorts of respects, it matters that Madison believes Thomas Jefferson's going to read them. And he tells Thomas Jefferson he's going to read them. He'd shared earlier congressional notes with Jefferson. Jefferson was in Paris, and I argue that it's because Jefferson returns in 1789 that Madison finishes the notes, that Jefferson reads at least part of the notes, that Jefferson's particularly interested in Hamilton's great speech on a plan, and so that the notes become part of Jefferson's understanding of the convention, and particularly of a sort of secret monarchist aspect of the convention, that the notes become part of Jefferson's effort to interpret the Constitution in a strict construction way. And then the book implies, I think, at the end that we have to be very careful about all of the comments that people made in the 1790s and early 19th century about whether there was secrecy, what the meaning of any promises to keep things secret are, and I suggest that a lot of that probably comes out of this Jefferson, Hamilton, Madison dance around the notes. Okay, and the third comment I guess I'll just say is I think the book ultimately tries to suggest that when we look through Madison's notes, the way he wrote them that summer, we can begin to see that, at least I believe, that it would have been impossible for the framers to comprehend the Constitution in the sense that we do. And what I mean by that is that I think when you read Madison's notes and you try and reconstruct what they looked like in 1787, the sense of the Constitution as we come to know it, as this sort of sacred, separate document that's going to be appended over time, that will be interpreted by a judiciary, that all postdates the Constitutional Convention. And I think we misread the convention in a sense because we know what's going to happen. It's just so hard to go back to a moment when the Constitution itself is uncertain. And so in this respect, the book tries to argue that Madison's revisions in some ways create this false sense of the moment. They come to create the sense that there's this dramatic shift between the system of government before the Constitution and the system of government after the Constitution. But that if you go back to that moment, you can see how that wasn't at all clear at the time, and it's only later that it becomes obvious that the Constitution will indeed radically change American government. The book spends a lot of time dealing with slavery, and I'm happy to talk more about that, but one of the things that was interesting to me in writing the book was that Madison doesn't revise a lot of his comments about slavery. What I argue he does do is in 1789, 1790, he writes that section, including comments made that suggest he is anti-slavery, but nobody else at that summer ever recorded him as being against slavery. And I guess the last thing I'll just say is a brief comment on originalism, because the book is deliberately silent on the topic. I think it won't surprise anyone that I'm not a member of the fraternity of original public meaning or of originalism itself. And I've given a lot of thought to this because whenever I speak about this, this is the question that people ask. I guess where I come down on this is I think most originalists in some ways still conflate constitutional interpretation, which I think in the Anglo-American tradition always has a space for historical inquiry, with originalism. And I continue to believe, I may be the only one who believes this, but that originalism requires one to believe that the only legitimate interpretation of the Constitution is one which arises from the belief that there's a single knowable, fixed, original understanding of the words in 1787, 1788. And I think, therefore, that what the book suggests implicitly is that originalism may rest on the profound misunderstanding that the convention as a collective knew it was drafting the Constitution. That is sort of an a priori question about how they understood everything. And I think what the book ends with is suggesting that the really interesting question that people haven't answered is, why is the Constitution such a remarkable success? How quickly it shifts the very understanding of American politics, such that people literally cannot remember how they used to think about things. And I think Jonathan's doing interesting work on that. So that's all I have to say, and thank you very much for listening.
I think Jack said alphabetical. I'm happy to go first.
Go ahead.
Sure.
I was wondering if our rules are, I guess we're going either by reverse alphabetically or perhaps by seniority.
Well, I was thinking by the mere chance of where you happen to be sitting.
Or it could just be a random distribution. So most of what I have to say is actually distilled from a rather long review of 32 pages, which I did of Mary's book. But before I did the review, as she intimated, both for her sake and as a referee for Harvard Press, I gave the kind of penultimate version of the manuscript, a pretty thorough reading, and made a number of suggestions. Anybody who wants to read the review, if you want to just send me an email, just my last name at stanford.edu, I'll send you a PDF file and random constitutional commentary in the current issue. So I have a range of points I want to make. It's an interesting, rich, deeply provocative, highly complicated, nuanced, suppositious, also in some ways very understated book. It's not the easiest book to come to grips with, and my sense from seeing different parts at different times is that Mary herself agonized a lot down to the end about exactly what form particular passages we're going to take, and that I think in some ways she may have moderated some of her views over time rather than made them as bold as they could have been, but in a lot of ways it's still a bold book. So for starters, I want to make 2 points about what it means to read this book as a historian. If your historian spends a lot of time working on the adoption of the Constitution, one likes to think, because it's so convenient, that whole legion of editors out there, whether you go back to the early 20th century guys like Max Farrand, Worthington C. Ford, and so on, and then the more recent editors, starting with Julian Boyd and the papers of Thomas Jefferson, and so on. We like to think that those guys did all the hard textual work, and we don't really need to think, in too precise detail about the documents per se, as such. And what Mary's book reminds us is that if you're morally committed to being a historian, you can't just be content with the contents and leave the editors to do the hard stuff. Because part of the historical value of a document originates in its physical qualities and characteristics and in its provenance. And if you don't come to grips with that, you don't want to take that seriously, in some ways you are defaulting on your moral, not just your scholarly, but really your moral obligations as a historian. So that's kind of point number one. Point number two, which is opposite of the moment and picks up on something Mary said, is if you want to be a historian, we're going to do a teach-in about the election in a couple of weeks, and Jonathan and I are both participating in that. And the first point I want to make there is, if you want to be a historian, you have to emphasize the capacity to be surprised. You have to be prepared to wake up on any given day and realize that what you expected was going to happen are all those polls from the guy at Princeton and what's his doodle, Nathan, Nate Silver and Nate Cohen. That's what the social scientists do. Gesund, that's fine for them. If you're a historian, you have to be prepared to be surprised. And one of the things you have to be prepared to be surprised about is not just events themselves, but also the record of them. So it may well be the case that material will become available to us, somewhat fortuitously, that actually forces or requires or induces us to rethink things we took very much for granted. So, this in sense, there's a moral posture of being a historian. If you really, all historical statements have to depend upon the evidence, and the evidence means not only the substance of the text, which you want to read in context, it may also be the physical properties of the text itself. But then secondly, to be surprised, that's important. Okay. Now, the great thing about Mary's book is that, because she insists on this point throughout, she forces us repeatedly from page to page to come to grips with that question. So she is, in that sense, kind of a historian squared. She is really insisting that we can't make any reliable judgments until we've really thought seriously and analytically about all the issues she's kind of raising. And yet, at the same time, this book is full of suppositions, many of which I find provocative, but also perhaps plausible, but not always persuasive. And a number of them I resist for a variety of reasons. And so there's a kind of interesting contrast, I think, in Mary's intellectual psyche here. On the one hand, between the scrupulousness of looking at the manuscript, but then there are some big imaginative leaps, which I think are really not wholly corroborated. So let me give a couple examples of that. The argument that this book was written primarily as a legislative diary and not for historical purposes, I find problematic as a Madisonian. And I don't see it in the mirror, but my regrets to know that I sometimes identify Madison as my alter ego, which is not really true, but on the other hand, not that far from the case either. I think Madison. I agree on the legislative diary part. I think it was part of Madison's political genius that he was always the best prepared guy on the floor. He always did his homework. He always briefed the issues. He always was prepared to take the initiative and try to set the agenda. And he also understood that if you want to try to influence or control a debate, it's really, really useful to know and recall what other people had said and to have that kind of record. But he brought a deep historical consciousness, particularly in the enterprise of constitution making, to all his activities. You see it in some of his documents. When he talks in his August 23, 1785 letter to Caleb Wallace about constitution making, he thinks back to the moment in 1776, his first public appearance, what it was like to try to frame a constitution back in 1776. When he talks about the issues of federalism in item 7 of the Vices of the Political System, he recollects the kind of mistaken assumptions about Republican compliance and compliance of the states with the recommendations of the Continental Congress that had prevailed then. And he entered into his preparations for the convention by doing his own historical research. And he came out of that research, which is primarily research into antiquity, but also looking at we call it the history of ancient and modern confederacies, and we saw his notes. I actually looked at his notebook at the 250th birthday celebration for Madison at the Library of Congress, March 16th or whatever, 2001, which is also when I met Jeff Sessions, who was chair of the Madison Commission for Congress. We had a nice conversation. Unlike Condi Rice, it doesn't mean I endorse his being, confirmed. So we actually looked at Madison's notes on ancient modern confederacies. A very fine little notebook. Madison came out of his research just deeply frustrated because, after all, those materials didn't really live up to his expectations. So I think he had a historical mind all along. And there's, it's a kind of false choice to say, well, diary, yes, history, not really. I think Madison was thinking about those things at the same time. So that's kind of substantive point number one. Substantive point number two is something Jonathan wants to speak about, so I'll just say this briefly. I'm not convinced that Jefferson was intended to be the primary audience. These guys have an extensive correspondence. Jefferson never says, Jemmy, please take some careful notes so I'm going to know what's going on. And I mean, there was one Madison reference, some midsummer letter where he says, by the way, I'm taking notes. But it's one thing to say that, it's another thing to say, Jefferson was the intended audience. So I remain skeptical of that. And actually, one of the really interesting things among many about Mary's book is she says Jefferson didn't really care about the notes. He was, in fact, what sets Jefferson apart is he was largely indifferent to this project that Madison had invested so much of his labors in. Jefferson thought in terms of natural rights more than, fixed constitutional doctrines. So there's a kind of bit of a puzzle there. Jonathan wants to say more about that, so I won't say anything more. A third thing that's really interesting, but this is where, you really get down to the nitty gritty, is if you were, as I like to say, if you spend most of your waking hours in the 18th century, which E.D. Gellis and I, like to do, and Jonathan too, and you kind of really work these materials, you realize there are lots of technical questions that just drive one nuts. And Mary's great at describing what some of these technical questions are. And I use that phrase actually used by our common mentor, Professor Bernard Balin at Harvard in his 1981-82 presidential address to the American Historical Association, where he talks a lot about, there's a lot of deep historical satisfaction in solving technical questions, which would drive most of you nuts, but when you try to engage in the kind of analysis that scholars want to do, these are the things we obsess about. So what are some examples here? Well, there are two or three things that I'll call on. Then I'll say one thing about originalism. So then I'll wrap up. So Mary has this very interesting argument that the concluding passages of item 11 of the Vices of the Political System, which is the pre-convention memorandum that Madison largely or perhaps completely drafted at the end of March and early April 1787, that the concluding passages, which are actually the first version of the famous argument of Federalist 10, were possibly or probably written at some later point. And I think you suggest, perhaps sometime during the summer or at the convention itself. I'm very skeptical about that, in part because there's a close comparison. This is a technical thing. There's a very close similarity between the concluding part of that analysis and a key paragraph in a letter that Madison wrote to George Washington, April 16, 1787, which recapitulates a good part of the argument. So I think that's the kind of technical argument. The question, when exactly did Madison have this idea? Most of you it won't matter, but to us, we want to kind of work things out day by day, week by week, month by month. This is an important question. The point that Mary raises about when did Madison, is there a lot of ex post rationalizing, whatever, Madison on the slavery question? I mean, it's a big argument in my book, Original Meetings, that a speech, I think it's June 28th or June 29th, Madison's speech, where he says the real difference of interest does not lie between the large and small states, but between the northern and the southern states, and it's partly a matter of climate. That's a very Montesquieuian reflection, but it's mostly, in fact, about the presence or absence of slavery. So Mary suggests that and a couple other related passages, may have been put into something Madison may have retrospectively wanted to put into the notes. I'm not convinced she has a plausible case as to why he would have wanted to do that. I mean, particularly since Mary presents Madison as being very ambivalent about whether the notes would ever be published. But so again, that's one of those kinds of questions. There's another question actually, which should be of a lot of interest to Mike and Mike McConnell, because I'm reading a long essay Mike has written about presidential power. Is that Mary describes, and I think in some ways this is a pretty plausible argument, that in Madison's notes were on kind of the point of collapse. Or Madison's note taking was at the point of collapse at the final weeks of the convention. But in fact, his discussions of the debates over the presidency in the week of September 4th and September 8th are pretty good. I mean, they're pretty deep and they're pretty authoritative, and they seem pretty sensible. And I kind of wonder where that came from. So those are if you're a constitutional scholar, there's an awful lot of stuff here to wrestle with. And these are just three examples, things I've really picked up. And the last point I want to make is, and I make this at the very end of the review, is that there is a great irony, whether or not you're originalist. Jonathan and I actually are originalists of a sort for, I think kind of complementary reasons, meaning that we think if you want to talk about the original meaning of the Constitution, there's no alternative to doing so than writing as a historian. That's to say, you have to, and that was the whole point of, my whole project when I did my book, Original Meanings. How can you possibly ask what the Constitution originally meant if you're not engaged in an essentially historical inquiry? Qu'est-ce que ça veut dire? What does that mean? How are you going to do it? I mean, that's kind of preoccupied me the last 25 years, so I have a big investment in this. The irony of originalism, however, is that exactly what Madison's doing is now largely irrelevant to the dominant strain in originalism, which is associated with the late Justice Scalia, with whom I worked, along with Mrs. Scalia, with whom we admired Madison's notes on ancient and modern confederacies. Because the whole theory of what's called semantic public meaning originalism, we don't care about the debates, except insofar as they illustrate linguistic usage. But the kinds of political concerns and objectives, which I've written about, and Jonathan writes about, and Mary writes about, and Bernie certainly cares about, those kinds of things are kind of irrelevant. So there is a kind of curious irony on the originalist side of the ledger. I'm done.
So I'm really pleased to be able to comment on this fantastic book, which I join Jack in thinking of as a kind of biography of the notes, not of James Madison himself, but of the notes. And Jack and Jonathan are addressing the book's account of Madison, as well as the ways in which its detailed examination of his writing and revision of the notes might cause us to question established ideas about what happened, or to question the account of those established ideas. So I want to instead focus on the kind of historical exercise that Mary is so elegantly performing in Madison's hand, which is a kind that I see sitting at the intersection of law, literature, and history. And so I was pleased that she referred to the fact that she had been an English major as an undergraduate, which I did not previously know. Writing a few years ago of what he calls law text past, historian Stephen Wilf lamented that, quote, text is of essential importance to legal historians and at the same time underexamined. I think it would be hard to say the same sentence now in light of Madison's hand, which takes up a number of tools from literary studies and the history of the book to fully examine the kind of text that Madison created, as well as the significance of the form of the text to what we can derive from it about Madison, about the Constitutional Convention, and about the nature of legislative and quasi-legislative deliberation at the time. So there are four interlocking literary concerns in particular that I'd like to flag as significantly informing Madison's hand. These include considerations of genre, which Mary touched upon a little bit, the question of audience, which both Mary and Jack referred to, the nature of the context, both material and intellectual, out of which the text was produced, and the attention to language and the significance of revisions in language. So turning to the first category, genre. There have perhaps been as many definitions of what genre is as literary critics discussing it. But as one writer has tried to synthesize a number of the different accounts of genre, quote, genres are the names readers give to types of text or performances that they recognize by type. As readers gain experience with a genre, they come to understand that the genre tacitly encodes rules of form, content, and/or thematic development, and readers invoke these rules to help them make sense of the text or performance. Recent work in law and literature and legal history has shown how the genre of something like case reports affects our understanding of how law is known and what kind of legal knowledge is important at a particular era, whether through the investigations of early case law in 13th century England that Tom McSweeney has performed, or through examination of the conventions of Victorian law reporting that Ayala Ben Yishai has explored. In Madison's hand, Mary draws our attention to legislative genres rather than judicial ones, branching out beyond the traditional law school and legal focus on cases and the judiciary as the center of attention. And she demonstrates how the notes began as a document partaking of the genre of a legislative diary, the kind of diary kept by a participant in English parliamentary proceedings, the debates of which were not published. The notes then shifted through subtle changes into a text that seemed on the surface more like a record of legislative debates. So why should this matter? The genre of a text presents an implicit norm about what is included and what is not. Looking at what doesn't fit within the assumed genre can provide clues about the larger meaning of the work. Likewise, being misled about the genre through a surface resemblance, like that of Madison's notes to a record of legislative debates, might lead the reader to assume the text reflects a more comprehensive account of what happened from Madison's perspective than it actually does. The second related literary concern is that of audience. Mary places weight throughout on the fact that Madison's notes, quote, were not initially written for posterity, they were composed for Madison's use with the intent to be shared with Thomas Jefferson. So I'm not calling into question the Jefferson as audience, I just want to think about what it would mean for that to be the case. Literary critic Wolfgang Iser, one of the founders of what was called reader response criticism, argued that every text has an implied reader whose set of references and understandings inform the work. But not every text has a flesh and blood implied reader, as Jefferson may have been for Madison's notes. As Mary shows in a number of respects, quote, as a future reader, Jefferson shaped the diary entries. She also demonstrates in the last chapter on the influence of Mr. Jefferson, how Jefferson became a kind of collaborator in the notes, in addition to a reader, as Madison adopted, quote, Jefferson's fears of a conspiracy to abandon Republican government and create a monarchical government, replacing several sheets in the notes that were inconsistent with this new position. This kind of complex relationship with and substantive effect of an audience member on a work is familiar from literary studies of arts associated with patronage, such as early modern plays performed before the king or queen, or court poetry, but Mary definitely demonstrates its significance in the study of American constitutional history as well. Third, the book self-consciously draws on scholarship on the history of the book, which tends to examine the conditions allowing for the production and circulation of texts. In one example of her deployment of techniques derived from the history of the book, Mary's careful attention to the paper Madison used in the manuscript permits her to draw conclusions about whether and when Madison might have revised the notes. As she suggests in her appendix on the evidence, the fact that two different types of paper occur in the manuscript and where the second type comes in, quote, is consistent with two scenarios. First, the paper change could be coincidental. Alternatively, the paper change could be significant. After originally writing the manuscript on 3 sheets of, I don't know how to pronounce it, deboucher paper or something, yeah.
I don't know.
Madison returned later and ripped off the final half sheet with the 12th vice. He wrote new material in the space following the 11th vice and then added 2 new half sheets to complete his thoughts. So this reliance on the paper and close examination of the material conditions underlying the notes allows her to conclude something about the substance of what happened and about the revisions. Last but not least, Madison's hand displays great sensitivity to the meanings of the terms that Madison used in the notes and the significance of substitutions, in parts analyzing those revisions as though they might be part of a poem or other highly condensed literary creation. And interestingly, I think there is a weight placed on the text and the exact language of the text that she's also claiming is not the way we should be interpreting the Constitution, perhaps, or we shouldn't be giving as much weight to the text. So at the very beginning of the book, Mary highlights the importance of the change from the original first sentence of the manuscript, which stated that Monday, May 14th, was the day fixed for the meeting of the deputies and convention for revising the federal Constitution, to the published version, which instead proclaimed that Monday, May 14th, 1787, was the day fixed for the meeting of the deputies and convention for revising the federal system of government, so no constitution there. Whereas the original suggests the notion that a constitution already existed under the Articles of Confederation and merely needed to be revised, the published account allows for the demarcation of a pre- and post-constitutional moment. As she concludes from this quote, no longer was there a gradual and ambiguous shift from a government under a federal constitution to one under a new constitution of a yet-to-be-determined nature. Madison's narrative instead neatly split American history into 2 periods. In 1787, the convention had revised a system of government into a constitution. So the short time available here doesn't make it possible to fully treat the entire range of literary sensitivity that Mary displays in Madison's hand, but I hope that these examples demonstrate the extent to which her biography of Madison's notes deploys literary techniques to illuminate and revise our understanding of crucial historical questions.
All right, well, I guess I'm up. Thanks to Michael and Mark, first of all, for organizing this roundtable, Jack and Bernie for participating, of course, Mary for writing this wonderful book that gives us an occasion to talk about it. And I want to start by emphasizing that. That's sort of the most important thing I have to say, that Mary's book is really a prodigious and impressive piece of scholarship that very much deserves the accolades it has received and the major awards that it's already received, and is destined to have a real influence on early American constitutional history in a profound way, I think, for decades to come. The reason why I think there are some obvious reasons, which I want to quickly speak to, is the importance of Madison's notes itself. It's perhaps not an overstatement that this is the most widely read, widely studied primary source in American history. It is the only detailed account we have of the Constitutional Convention that gathered for 4 months in the summer of 1787 without Madison's notes. One could polemically contend we would know next to nothing about what happened there. So it's been scrutinized for a long time, and every account of the Constitution ever written, its creation, is entirely built on it. And yet, even though people have known for a long time that the notes were revised to some extent, people have implicitly proceeded almost by blind faith, as though they were more or less an accurate transcript that would allow us to understand the debates that occurred in Philadelphia. And it's only with Mary's book that finally a scholar has actually studied the notes themselves as the primary subject of research. So moving forward, people will not cease to write books on the Constitution. It will be nearly impossible not to reckon with the arguments she makes and the ways in which she shows that actually this is not a straightforward transcription that was taken down by a stenographer in the summer of 1787, but is a much more complicated work. So that's the first reason why I think it's very important. But I actually think a set of reasons that are less obvious point to the real significance and real achievement of the book, what makes the book a towering success in my mind. Mary could have written a book which merely cataloged all of the ways that Madison actually revised the notes. I know from reading the book carefully and talking to her that doing that would have taken an extraordinary amount of work, just that, just telling us what he revised. And that would have been incredibly impressive, but I think ultimately would have yielded a much less interesting story and wouldn't have opened up a lot of roads moving forward. It would have served as effectively a kind of grand debunking, that this great historical text should be moved to the fiction section of the bookstore, and we should stop paying attention to it. She emphatically does not do that. She doesn't just tell us how he revised the notes, something that takes all this work. What she also then does, and spends most of the book doing, is arguing, and I think persuasively, why knowledge of the revisions actually enhances their importance. They give us more reason to study them and read them, as opposed to less. And in so doing, it opens up all these possibilities and raises all these questions that me, Jack, Bernie, so many other people can now wrestle with that we would not have been able to ask had she not done this work. So I want to spend the remainder of my comment by picking it up on that. I want to focus on two things in particular that is opened up by how Mary shows how the notes are enhanced by understanding that they were revised far, far more than we thought. But then I also want to push back against some of the interpretations she offers and pass along some critical questions in the process that she can respond to. So the first of the 2 points I want to make concerns motive. She absolutely proves, I think, very persuasively that Madison did revise his notes far more than we thought, and did the bulk of these revisions starting in the fall of 1789, a full 2 years after the Constitutional Convention adjourned on September 17th, 1787. But then that raises the question of motive. Okay, so he revised them. Why did he revise them? And this brings us to the famous Jefferson thesis, as I like to call it, and upon which Jack alluded. This is, I think, to I think I'm being fair, this is Mary's answer to the question of motive. It's a very subtle, deft book. She gives a lot of attention to other possible motives, so I don't want to shortchange that, but this is really the motive that emerges, that James Madison has his friend Thomas Jefferson on his mind. He's in Paris, he's soon to come back, and Madison returns to the notes in earnest in the fall of 1789, finishes filling in all the sections after August 22nd, and then also going back and changing things that he thinks Jefferson might not like, to more or less begin transforming the notes into a set of political principles that make Madison look like the Jeffersonian Republican he is becoming, and perhaps less like the nationalist that he was in 1787. So I think there is certainly something to this. I don't deny that Jefferson is on his mind. But I would argue instead that actually, compared to Jefferson, a range of other motivations were more important that could have received more attention. In particular, Madison's time as a member of Congress throughout 1789, in which the first federal Congress, a body that I spend a lot of time studying, is the first group of people to really pick up the Constitution and have to reckon with what this thing actually is. What does it mean to be subject to this authoritative document? It's one thing to write a Constitution, it's another thing to debate it, it's another thing to ratify it. But to actually put it into practice, to actually sort out its limits, its boundaries, its contents, its essence, I think a lot of that was deeply unsettled in the spring of 1789. And it's actually Madison's firsthand experience through the debates of April of 1789 through, I think, really the Bill of Rights in August and September of 1789 that have a far greater influence on his motivation to return to the notes. Now, Mary alludes to these things, as I said, but I think that's an interesting conversation to have, the Jefferson thesis vis-a-vis, I would suggest, Madison's firsthand experience with the Constitution. The relationship that matters to him in 1789, I think, is his relationship with the Constitution, more so than his relationship with Jefferson. So that raises a critical question of really whether Thomas Jefferson, who cast this enormous shadow from then on in the book, that it's almost impossible to think that Madison was doing anything without his friend in mind, wondering his friend, sort of the panopticon leering over his shoulder. I would push back against that a bit and wonder if that doesn't downplay Madison's own relationship to the Constitution. And I partly suggest this alternative interpretation because of one of Mary's great achievements in the book, which brings me to the second and last point I want to consider, which is that Madison's revisions help us see the fundamental dynamism of early American constitutionalism. The formal training in law tends to treat the Constitution as a known thing that, regardless of how we might interpret it, has more or less existed since it literally came into existence, was written down and ratified. But I think Mary's book, in a lot of ways, shows very well how Madison's thought is in flux during these years, and similarly, as a result, how constitutional assumptions themselves are in flux. And that's why the book, I think, is much less about thought. It's much less about what Madison or anybody else thought than it is about the activity of thinking. It's about solving problems over time when you don't really know what you're doing. It's about thinking as an activity that can't be reduced to a moment. So I think Mary does a fantastic job of showing how appreciating the revisions of the notes is so important because it shows Madison's mind in motion, which is how people actually think. And it's not usually how we portray people after the fact. I think it's a really sort of a beautiful lesson that she imports. But I think the same thing can then be said about the Constitution. And here I would push Mary because I think she comes to the edge of what I think are a set of profound questions and implications and really stops there. So my second point is really about less a criticism than more an urging of how you might have moved forward. As I think you yourself quote, you say that the notes indicate the impossibility of the delegates fully comprehending the final text of the Constitution in its entirety. That we assume, with all the constitutional assumptions that we have come to possess over 200 plus years of history, we can only imagine they had similar assumptions in 1787. They were making not just a constitution, but the Constitution. And you do a good job, I think, of suggesting that they couldn't see that. But then this brings me to the questions pertaining to originalism. So if you say that first quote that I quoted on the first few pages, on page 239 of a 240-page book, you end by saying, if original understandings of the convention existed, we cannot retrieve them. And I think this poses two separate questions. There are two distinct possibilities for how one might interpret this. And you don't tell us which it is you have in mind, and I think the difference is extremely important. One is that due to the state of the notes, encumbered as they are with all these layers of revisions, recovering the original understandings is epistemologically impossible. We simply can't access them. But a different reading is that no matter the quality of the records, the revisions also show us that there isn't, in fact, anything ontologically there to recover, that the Constitution has not meaningfully come to exist yet, that appreciating the revisions of the notes, appreciating the instability and flux and thinking in motion that Madison's revisions show, suggests that it's not just can we or can't we access this thing, it's that maybe that thing isn't the thing we should be pursuing after all. But I'll end by where I started. I myself can only make these criticisms, can only raise these questions, can only think about the exciting ways we might pursue them because of Mary's book. So in some ways, to the extent there is any kind of disagreement, that is very much built upon the success of your work.
Thank you.
And I want to throw in one final question, maybe slightly more prosaic than especially Jonathan's. I have to read that text in order to, but it's a somewhat more prosaic question having to do with your conclusion that that the text is de-emphasized, meaning the text not just of the notes but of the Constitution itself is de-emphasized. And I have a somewhat opposite reaction to your book about this, which is that so much of the text of the Constitution was actually worked out in committees, not on the floor of the convention at all, but in especially the committee of detail, but also of style, and the committee of postponed matters, a few other committees as well, and we tend to have their notes separate from Madison, especially the committee of detail. I mean, they're incomplete and they're missing, but it's a rather prodigious body of paper with lots of interesting information in it. That makes, and with no debate on the floor, so what we really have is text coming to us unmediated by convention discussion. That makes me think that actually we should be paying more attention to text than ever, because it actually isn't that affected by the interesting conclusions of your book.
That's a good. I don't know. Do you want me to answer all?
Well, I think we do have from here to midnight to do that. You should answer whatever you're inspired to answer, but we would like to hear some.
Let me just say, first of all, thank you to everybody. I have to say, I'm just so happy anybody read the book, and I'm still in that mode of like, wow, 4 people actually read the book. That's actually, I'm sort of just super happy about that. And I think I don't know how to explain this. Weirdly, I'm just so happy that people are back in a space where a lot of questions that I think for a very long time on the American law side and the American history side and the American political science side seemed foreclosed are opened up again. So I think if there's one thing that all of these comments sort of resonate with me, which is I care immensely that the notes be put back in a sort of place where people can engage with them for all the exciting ways that they are interesting, as opposed to something that's very, this tells us what the answer is to everything. And in part that's because I think that I find this period in American history incredibly exciting if one sees it as, I like Jonathan's word, dynamic, and filled with people thinking. That's something that Jack's working on, where we come to those texts with, I think, this is comes from the literary tradition that I know Bernie's talking about, with a lot of humility about what we can understand from those texts. And so in some ways I care, I guess, about the whole book. The takeaway from the book is I care less about whether on a certain bunch of things people in the end completely agree with me or not, than that suddenly you can think about all of these questions. You can think about, what really did Charles Pinckney do, or all of these things that just seem very boring and I think sedate. I'll just make a couple comments about things. I like Jefferson as an audience. I just happen to think that. Jefferson read Madison's congressional notes. He said they were fabulous. He loved sharing them. Madison writes to him at the beginning, I can't say anything more to you. Then he writes in July, I'm going to share them with you. Then he shares them. So I kind of don't know what more proof you could have that he's an audience, other than Dear Madison, thanks a lot. Glad you took them for me. I'm sort of I don't really know about that. Jefferson makes a copy of the notes. So I think what actually Jonathan and Jack are really talking about is what emphasis does Jefferson have on the situation? Sort of what's the relative dynamic there? And I just ended up feeling, and maybe this is because I worked a lot with Jefferson's copy. Jefferson got his nephew to basically come to town and take the notes. And then some correspondence that certainly I read as Madison's exasperation that Jefferson's never looked at the damn thing very carefully, really worried about it. I ended up feeling that the part I guess I wanted to emphasize was the notes as part of the two of them engaged in American politics. And so, I probably put a little bit more emphasis on it because I was in that space. I think Jack's completely right that I probably don't give quite enough emphasis to give enough respectful sort of space to Madison's real engagement with his interest in ancient and modern confederacies and the history of it, and I think I could probably shifted that. I think Jonathan's really right that I hint again at this, but sort of Madison's completely fascinated by the early congressional debates. He loves the fact that you can't figure out what the Constitution means. He loves the fact he writes these things where he's like, I went back, basically, I looked at it. It turns out you can't really tell, I was there, but now I can't figure out what we meant. And there's 4 different possibilities. And I do think that his interest in that is very much a part of that. I think that goes to Michael's question about text. And what I mean isn't that the text isn't important, because I think they're interested in the text, but that what Madison tells us the text means. And Madison seeming like the precise words mattered. I personally think Madison cared about the structural concepts and big balances. I don't think he really worried that much originally in 1787 about the words. I also think, and I wrote about this in an earlier article, I think the degree to which the Constitution, in a lot of its sections, in the end was written in committee matters immensely. And that the Constitution, because of that, if you literally track what the Constitution looks like as it goes into the following weeks, you realize that literally it doesn't look anything like what we imagine, what we come to know. And then it gets smashed together really quickly, and then they're determined to get out of there. And so we imagine they see it in this way that I really feel that they don't. And in some ways that's to circle back to Bernie's point, I think, about genre, there's an internal thing going on in the book, which is, in some ways, the book ultimately, I think, asks us to think about the Constitution as a genre. Because the American Constitution does come to be a genre. It comes to be a genre that we're very familiar with, but that they're not so familiar with, or that's just being created, and the conventions around that genre are being created. And in some ways, I guess one thing that I think would be very interesting for people to think a lot harder about is how in this very dynamic period is very quickly that sense of here's what the genre of a constitution looks like. Here's how we're going to interpret it. Here's how we're going to understand it. Here's how we're going to debate it. And the book sort of ends there. The book doesn't really talk a lot about that, but that's sort of inherent, I think, in probably like the last paragraph. I have to say two things lastly about this book. Unlike Jack, I personally don't have a lot of. Madison doesn't really resonate a lot with me. Maybe it's a gender thing or something, but I don't know. But I did end up, like, you spend enough time with him, and he has these very strong ways of being, and so he gets into your brain. And one of the things that became really clear is Madison develops this style for his fair copy where he creates a sort of strong summary sentence, topic sentence for all the speakers, which once you realize is there, you're like, there's no way anybody speaks like that, okay? But I had spent so much time with that when I went to write my book, I started writing completely in that style. And so you can literally read my book by reading the first sentence of every paragraph. And I feel like this is the greatest gift Madison gave me, because I was speaking to some undergraduates about the book, and they were like, that's really awesome. Because, so that's a part. And then I guess my last comment, and again, I think this is something that everybody alluded to a little bit. I think one of the things that I also learned about from Madison, I suppose, in writing the book, is there's an advantage in pulling back and being a little bit moderate. And so one of the things I worked very hard on in the book is to give evidence about everything, to call things speculative when I thought it was worth being speculative. But the book is probably more moderate than it, than after 2 drinks I might be about the book. So, because I thought, you know what, unlike Madison, I don't get to go back and revise it, so I better get it right the first time.
Thank you. Well, we really don't have time, but we're going to take a few questions from the audience anyway. So if you could please come down and speak into the microphone so that everyone is able to hear. We really only have time for a few. So
I have, this is on? Yes. 2 questions. First, did the people that attended the convention have an outline of what they want to put into the convention? Number 1. Number 2, is there a precedent or a preceding document that or constitution they used as a guide?
So there was a something I sort of refer to it as, I think in some ways it's the first constitution, called the Articles of Confederation, which governed the new states, but it was very different in all sorts of ways. Jack has a wonderful book on the Articles of Confederation. And so in some ways they're revising that, and they come to the federal convention, to the Constitutional Convention, with different plans. And Madison and the Virginians have the most famous plan. And so partly what the book, one of the themes in my book is about how, in some ways, Madison, the story of the convention has a rhythm in Madison's notes where he thinks he's going to win, he's going to get both houses with proportional representation, he's going to destroy the states ever having a vote in the national government, he's super happy, the smaller states gather up, they fight back, he then starts losing like crazy, he doesn't even get elected to committees because he stands for everything everybody can't stand. By July, he's in this just complete state of depression, along with the entire Virginia delegation, not all of them, and they actually vote for a executive on lifetime tenure. And so that's a bad vote, right? Even given whatever your current politics are. And that's so in some ways, and then Madison out of that begins to reconstruct himself in part by taking his notes, by keeping his notes, and eventually becomes a player again. And so the book follows the story of Madison's sort of successes and triumphs and tries to read the notes less as this objective text and more as the story of a political participant who thinks he's going to win, then is totally losing, now reconstructing himself. So it's that kind of a scenario.
Bernadette talked about this, but I was wondering if you could expand on a little bit more about your methodology for determining what was written when. And also I was wondering how late into his life was Madison revising his notes?
Yeah, I think that the book would have been written by somebody else a long time ago, but for a couple fortuities, so the book uses two things. It uses a lot of textual evidence. What I did was there's a pretty good transcript of the notes that the government created in the late 19th century when historians complained that they couldn't get access to stuff. They created a transcript, and it shows a lot of the revisions. And that version of the notes, which is called the documentary history version, has just been forgotten about by historians. It's a wonderful version. And I actually using colored pencils, which was the extremely low-tech technique, I color-coded using other versions of the notes and then this copy of the journal that Madison makes, what sections I thought were probably for 1787 and what parts weren't. And so I have a crazy color-coded version of this myself. And a lot of that came out of changes in things that Madison obviously inserted elsewhere that you can tell from tiny print. A lot of this comes from stylistic issues. Madison never wrote his name out in full in the summer of 1787, but in the later part always writes Madison. And so there's a whole textual piece that would be familiar to anybody who does sort of textual literary studies. Then because digital technology has changed, one of the things that digital technology does is in the old days, it was very expensive to take watermark photographs because you needed to, because standard cameras, you had to use special techniques. One of the weird advantages of digital photography is that you can take pictures of watermarks straight at a light table and get a good image. And so the Library of Congress took a number of exceptionally high quality watermark pictures for me, and then we went through every folio of the notes, taking pictures of all the watermarks, and watermarks don't tell you anything, they just tell you the paper's different, but the difference in paper and the consistency of paper and the other letters that he wrote lined up with a story that the text supported. And so the watermark evidence is backdrop to the whole thing. But it's in the process of doing that I'll just tell you this story. I was down there and I had this terrible cold. And so we've got the Madison's notes out, and we're inside like the heart of the conservation lab. And I have this terrible cold, and so I'm sniffling. And I always have my hands behind my back when I'm down there because I don't want anything bad to happen and then be blamed. And I'm going like sniffling, and then finally they just like stop. Can you just hold the Kleenex over your nose the whole time, like that? And then another time I'd cut my finger on the library's card, so I pull my hand out to take notes, and I realized like there's blood dripping down my hand. So I put my hand back in my pocket, and I'm like writing, trying to pretend I'm a lefty while I did it, because I thought bleeding over Madison's papers is unlikely gonna do it. But you can do this yourself. It's pretty easy. If you take any page after August 22nd and you pull out the journal, and what you will see is it's like copied from the journal, copied from the journal, copied from the journal, and then like a sentence. And it's those sentences, some of which I argue in the book. The ones that make no sense, I argue, are probably original. The ones where Madison says, there's a couple where Madison's like, basically like, this obviously means the difference between aiding and abetting. So some distinctions for legal things, I argue, come out of the 1789 period once he's become interested in a lot about this interpretive text.
This may be inappropriate and fine. Could you give us some examples of where the Supreme Court, looking at the originalist, looking through these notes, would have changed their interpretation based on your research relative to the interpretation they picked based on the reference to the notes without this interpretation?
Yeah. So no, and it's an excellent question, and I have no idea what the answer to that is. And part of that is, and it's not that I didn't look; it's that that the Supreme Court is sort of an epistemological question that I think in some ways goes back to my things. That is, there's two ways in which the notes have influenced people. One is the notes, understood as an objective text, tell an entire story of a narrative about a constitution that one could argue the Supreme Court relies on in its understanding anytime it goes back and it says Madison's note says anything or we know anything that happens in 1787. And the book, I think, seeks to unsettle that a little bit. The Supreme Court rarely, up until recently, ever cited directly to the notes themselves. And there's a few places where they do. They much preferred the Federalist. They've always preferred the Federalist. There are recent cases where some of the scholarly work that's led to the Supreme Court's decision looks at the notes, but the Supreme Court itself has been pretty careful not to cite directly to the notes as the previous thing. But in dissents by Justices Scalia and Thomas, there are references to the notes, and I think in one or two opinions there are. But this is not a aha book in that sense, and deliberately not, because the book's really not aimed at contemporary constitutional interpretation in that regard.
I wonder if you'd share this reaction to that question, which is, it would be good to have interpreters read the entire notes, in your book too, but obviously your book too, but a more besetting sin than anything that you've been talking about is a tendency to just cherry pick particular snippets without an understanding of what's going on.
Yeah, and I did this.
And I think the court has rarely shown the latter. I mean,
yeah.
The sense
you
of
see it a
the
lot in law review articles, and I did this myself, which is, there's this funny, now I'm like, why wasn't this so obvious to me? But there's this funny thing when you're interested in a sort of, gosh, I wonder how the convention thought about a certain topic that gets decided after August 22nd. And you go back and you look at the notes, and there's situations where Madison's like, almost like there were two ways to understand this, and this was the one. Okay, now I'm like, wait, that's so obviously like, here's the right way or the distinction. I think that law review, I think people who write about constitutional interpretation right now in law reviews, the book will make a little queasy about how they line those sentences up. And I think that's important. I mean, my own big takeaway, I guess, from the convention, and that I wish people would write more about, is we take so much for granted about the convention, the things that seem so obvious to us. So we spend all our time when we write about the convention sort of focusing on the things that are still interesting to us, instead of what I think is really remarkable is that the things that they, with the significant and major and important exception of slavery, the Constitution was remarkably successful in solving a set of deep political things that had been struggled over in the United States, and why that's so successful, why it's so successful that we don't even worry about these problems any longer is is just completely fascinating to me. And so, if you take the executive, there's a lot of work on the executive, but they never had an executive. And so sort of why does everyone so quickly move to accept a unitary executive? I mean, there's a lot of things like that if you go back to the notes, you suddenly realize are much more interesting questions.
Well, with that, I thank everyone for their attendance, and especially Professor Bilder for those interesting remarks. Right after we applaud, there is a reception outside, so please take advantage of that, and we can have more casual conversation. So thank you.